On November 14th, 1886, at daybreak, the mercury in the nailed tin thermometer outside the Sage Hollow General Store stood at 11 degrees above zero, and the wind from the northwest carried enough ice in it to sting the eyes before a man had crossed the street. Clayton knew Sage Hollow as a shallow basin of the Wyoming Territory, with 312 souls, one rail spur, one church, one schoolhouse, and one store. Each building raised in haste over the previous 12 years, with pine frames hauled dear and thin from distant mills. From job after job, he had heard the local creed that height meant safety. The houses people praised lifted their eaves high, wore clapboard sides, and burned wood hard through broad iron stoves that drew like chimneys on locomotives. In ordinary winters, he had seen that pride survive the cold. In severe winters, he had seen it burn faster. Clayton Caldwell stood that same morning at the edge of town where the packed street gave way to alkali crust, his coat collar up, his gloves split at the fingers, and his former life still visible in the way he looked at a roofline before he looked at a man. He had drawn the plans for 6 of those tall frame houses when Sage Hollow was rising and credit was easy, and he had once eaten at tables where his name was spoken with confidence. Then came a freight contract that failed after spring floods washed out 2 bridge crossings. A chain of debts called in at once, and a bank claim that took his office, his tools, and the lot where he had planned to build his own home. He was 38 then, broad-shouldered still, with a carpenter's hands gone rough to laborer's callous, and no standing left except what could be carried in his memory and his back. The memory that mattered most had come years earlier from his mother's brother, Elias Ward, a mason who had worked military ovens and root vaults along the Platte, and taught that winter was not beaten by flame alone, but by mass, seal, and patience. Elias had died of lung fever in the winter of 1879, but before that, he had made Clayton stack stone by hand and then sit beside cooling masonry to feel what remained after fire was gone. A wall that keeps heat does not boast, he had told him. It simply does not surrender. The lesson was not romantic, and it offered no status. It offered survival measured in fewer logs, steadier rooms, and fewer funerals after blizzards. When his credit collapsed, Clayton searched the parcels no one else wanted and found one on a low bench south of Willow Creek, outside the formal town limits where taxes were lighter because the soil was judged poor for crops and too exposed for comfort. The tract was 12 acres of alkali, greasewood, and wind, purchased from the county agent for $63 cash and a deferred fee of $8 recorded against spring labor. He bought 6,000 adobe bricks from a yard near Fort Laramie at $4.75 per thousand, paying wagon freight that nearly doubled the bill, and he hired 2 teamsters for one day at $2 each to unload. From a collapsed lime kiln 3 miles east, he salvaged broken stone at no cost except sweat, prying each block free with bar iron and loading it himself because no man in Sage Hollow had leisure to help one whose luck had soured. By the end of December, he had staked a rectangle 22 feet by 16, turned its long face toward the winter sun, and cut into the slope until the rear wall stood mostly below grade. He laid a stone footing 18 inches deep, bedded it in clay and sand, then raised adobe courses to a full 20-inch thickness, each joint pressed tight with a tempered mix of local earth, straw, and water hauled in barrels from the creek. The floor he kept as packed earth over a 6-inch gravel layer, tamped in lifts so moisture could move without pooling. At the entrance, he built a south-facing vestibule 6 feet deep, narrow as a throat, to catch the first assault of wind before it touched the main room. As wagons passed, he noticed neighbors watching him set each brick with line and level, as if he were building for inspection by a court that no longer recognized him. The heart of the dwelling was a masonry stove he built from fire bricks salvaged from an abandoned smelter stack and from iron plate bought secondhand for $6.40. Its firebox was small by frontier taste, 20 inches wide and 16 deep, with a brick baffle that lengthened the path of hot gas so heat would stay in the mass rather than rush up the flue. He set the chimney near the center line to reduce draft shock from crosswind, sealed joints with clay slip and ash, and tested every seam with a tallow candle, watching flame tilt where leaks remained. Fuel was split cottonwood, not because it was noble wood, but because he could cut it along Willow Creek and season it under a shed roof for 2 full summers. For immediate use, he had already secured older, long-seasoned stock from pre-cut piles, while the cottonwood he began cutting in May 1887 was meant for future winters. In his ledger, he marked each cord by date, moisture, and burn duration. There was no room for guesswork left in him. On the first Saturday in January 1887, when the freight bells rang and teams crowded the street, Silas Pemberton stepped onto his store porch in a broadcloth coat, with beaver collar, polished boots, and the easy carriage of a man whose shelves were full and whose credit still held eastward. He had once financed Clayton's larger jobs and had once called him partner in public, though never on paper. Clayton, working within earshot, heard him point toward the low mound of fresh plaster beyond town and say, "There is Caldwell's burrow, gentlemen, a hole fit for a badger, and the ambitions of a man who forgot how houses are meant to stand." Laughter traveled quickly in cold air. By evening, Clayton heard boys repeat the phrase "near the pump," and by the next week he overheard women use it to describe any choice, thought mean, cramped, or defeated. He took that as proof that in Sage Hollow, names became verdicts long before facts did. Clayton heard the name from a passing drayman and did not answer him. He set another course of brick in silence, then measured his wall thickness again with a marked stick he carried in his apron pocket. A day later, when an old laborer asked whether the talk in town troubled him, he gave the only line he would repeat for months afterward. "Let them talk," he said, not lifting his eyes from the trowel. "Words do not keep out wind, and mockery does not warm a child." It was not defiance for display. It was an operating rule. He had lost standing, contracts, and access to rooms where decisions were made. He refused to lose method as well. By March, the dwelling was closed in and whitewashed inside with lime slurry for light and sanitation. He added 2 small windows on the south wall, each 12 by 18 inches and none on the north. He banked the exterior rear and side walls with a 2-foot berm of earth mixed with straw and gravel, then planted willow cuttings at the toe to hold spring runoff. He dug a root cellar 8 feet long, 6 wide, and 7 deep, shored with stone and capped in timber, reached by a hatch inside the vestibule so no one needed to step into weather for stores. In that cellar, he stacked sacks and jars according to weight and spoilage risk, beans low and cool, canned vegetables above. Smoked meat hung where air moved but frost did not bite. He marked all of it in neat lines, pounds, quarts, dates, and intended ration rates for severe weather. By the second week of May, when mud season loosened the roads and Clayton heard men at the store speak again of expansion, he began cutting cottonwood in earnest, selecting trunks 8 to 10 inches through, splitting rounds to wrist-thick lengths, and stacking them under a slatted lean-to with open ends for cross-draft. From wood piles he passed and talked, he listened to. He judged that most households in Sage Hollow still bought fuel green in late autumn, burned hot to drive off moisture, and accepted smoke and waste as the unavoidable tax of frontier life. Clayton ran a different arithmetic. He tracked 1 month of spring heating and found his stove consumed less than a quarter cord, while maintaining indoor temperatures between 52 and 58 degrees at dawn, a range many in town would have called stingy, until they considered what 10 cords cost by February, when wagons were slow and prices rose. Summer carried his reputation no upward distance that he could see. At church socials, committee women thanked him for offering to speak on low wood heating and then deferred to others. At the store, men with full purses compared parlor wallpaper while stepping around him as if around a post. Silas extended no credit and no greeting. Yet, work advanced. Clayton repaired the shed roof, widened the vestibule shelf for water barrels, and set iron hooks for hanging damp coats where heat from the masonry could dry them without flooding the room with steam. He was rebuilding dignity in inches because inches were what remained available. Every handspan of wall, every sealed seam, every seasoned stick of wood was a statement that failure in commerce need not become failure in judgment. When autumn light began to thin in September of 1887, the borough sat complete on its alkali bench, modest as a fieldstone and plain as a shovel, while the town below shone with taller roofs and higher claims. From remarks he heard in passing, most people in Sage Hollow still seemed sure they understood which form represented progress. Clayton Caldwell believed the weather would decide that argument soon enough, and he went on measuring. And by the last week of September, the marks in his ledger began to align with signs no town committee had voted to notice. The geese that usually lingered along Willow Creek into mid-October lifted in hard, decisive V's, while cottonwood leaves were still mostly gold. Beaver work rose in fresh tiers, mud packed high and thick against expected water and ice. On 2 evenings in a row, sunset arrived mild and red. Then the temperature dropped so quickly after dark that bucket rims filmed white before full night had settled. Clayton checked his wall seams by lamplight and said nothing in town yet, because one sign could be dismissed as chance, but 3 signs in 1 week made a pattern. By the first days of October, Sage Hollow had turned almost festive under a false warmth that climbed to 68 degrees by noon and held long enough for shirt sleeves on porches. Late beans ripened in kitchen plots that usually yielded only green pods by frost. Men talked at Silas Pemberton's steps about 1 more shipment before serious cold and 1 more month before heavy burning began. Children ran with coats open, and women left wash lines out through dusk. Clayton rode in on October 3rd, with frost still in the shadows under creek brush, tied his horse at the rail, and stood with his hat in both hands while the Saturday crowd thickened around flour sacks and kerosene tins. He gave warning in plain measures, not sermon. "Bank 6 days of water indoors before your first heavy drift," he said. "Seal your north walls with sod and clay, and reduce stove draw with a brick baffle, so heat stays in your room and not in the chimney. I watched a 24-degree drop in less than 3 hours last night. This next system will not be a passing squall." His voice remained even, but it carried because fear had no use to him unless translated into action. A teamster asked how much brick each household needed. Clayton answered, 3 to 5 courses in the throat can cut wood burn near half, if your seams are tight and your fuel is seasoned. Silas answered from the porch rail before anyone else could commit to listening. He stood broad and fed on store profit. His coat fitted close and his gloves new, beard trimmed straight along a jaw that had not missed many meals since rail service reached the basin. "A borough dweller fears weather because he forgot how houses are meant to stand," he said. And laughter followed because social certainty was easier to purchase than dry wood and careful labor. He called for Jonah Pike to bring out the new cord ledger and announced green cottonwood at $11 a cord, payable cash or by note at spring interest. Several families signed before noon. Clayton watched each name go down and recognized in that quiet ink a winter arithmetic many would not survive unchanged. He left without dispute, rode home in heat that felt borrowed, and spent the afternoon widening his connector trench from vestibule to cellar so it could take 2 people passing shoulder to shoulder with bundled arms. The trench measured 28 feet from hatch to outer shelter point, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, with plank cover sections that could be lifted from inside by rope if drifts buried the surface. He lined the lower half with split stone set dry for drainage, packed the upper half with sod, and drove iron eye bolts at 4-foot intervals into posts sunk beneath grade. At dusk, he tested the line blindfolded, palm to iron, counting steps by touch. This was not fear work. It was transfer work, built so another body could move through whiteout without seeing sky or landmark. In the second week of October, he shifted from household sufficiency to reserve capacity. He hauled 2 more wagon loads of bean sacks from a farmer east of Deerfield at $3.10 per 50-pound sack, paid in coin and in 2 days of repair labor on a broken granary gate. He smoked venison strips over low willow coals until they bent without cracking and stacked 90 pounds in waxed cloth wraps. He packed turnips, carrots, and choke cherries in glass and stoneware, bringing his cellar to 140 quarts of canned stores, then sealed each lid edge in tallow and ash. He sorted kindling by moisture, wrote burn durations on slate tags, and set the driest bundles near the vestibule bench for emergency ignition when hands were too numb for fine motion. Church committee members met on a mild Sunday under open coats and declined his standing offer to demonstrate low-wood heating in the schoolhouse. Their spokesman, Reverend Talbot, did not insult him outright. He simply called the proposal an unnecessary alarm in a season of provision and returned to discussing a new bell rope. On Monday, boys near the pump repeated Caldwell's Burrow as a taunt for any child who brought patched mittens. On Tuesday, 2 ranch hands passed his bench and asked whether he planned a tunnel clear to Utah. Clayton kept tamping clay around the north berm and answered neither. He had learned that mockery sought witness more than target. Deprived of witness, it thinned. By late October, freight from Rawlins arrived 3 days behind schedule. The delay might have meant little by itself, but telegraph notes posted at the store grew sparse, then ceased altogether. Clayton rode west of town to a rise where one could watch the rail cut and saw no smoke for 48 hours. He returned and set 2 additional water barrels in the vestibule, each 20 gallons, then wrapped them in wool and canvas to slow freezing. He cut stove clay with chopped straw and stored 6 pails by the door, enough for 10 households to seal firebox cracks or stovepipe joins under stress. He wrote instructions in large hand on 12 scrap boards. Choke, draw 1/3. Keep ash bed 1 inch deep. Never overfire green wood. Warm, frost-bitten hands in tepid water, not near open flame. He stacked the boards where he could lift them quickly. On November 12th, wind turned and held northwest for 36 straight hours, dry and mean, carrying powder snow that did not stick yet, but marked corners where drifts would later build. 2 coal cars derailed in a cut west of Rawlins as word finally came through a passing line rider rather than wire, and no replacement reached Sage Hollow. Freight teams turned back from half-traveled roads when wheel ruts hardened and disappeared under skittering ice. In town, Silas doubled lamp oil and flour margins and assured buyers resupply would come within the week. His shelves still looked full then, and full shelves made denial persuasive. Families bought what they could and burned what they had, fast and hot, in iron stoves that glowed red at seams. Clayton moved his own operation into disciplined rounds. At dawn, he checked interior wall temperature by touch and by hanging mercury at shoulder height away from direct stove line. By noon, he cut and stacked relay bundles. By evening, he rotated cellar stores by spoilage risk and logged projected ration rates at 1,800 calories per adult for heavy labor days, lower for shelter days. He slept in 2-hour intervals during wind events to inspect flue draw and vestibule frost line. On one such night, with stars hidden and eaves singing under gusts, he stood in the doorway between main room and vestibule and spoke into the dark, as if addressing Elias Ward across years in stone. "You taught mass and patience. I have both. Give me clear judgment for the rest." He then closed the inner door and returned to his ledger. On November 28th, the barometer dropped hard enough that his hanging needle shifted 3 marks between breakfast and mid-morning. Snow began not in heavy flakes, but in dry, stinging grains blown level from the northwest, each grain too small to seem dangerous until they joined in numbers beyond counting. Clayton looked at his stores, then at the sheep shed 40 paces downslope, unused since spring shearing, and changed his plan from endurance to intake. He stripped the shed of loose boards, lined interior walls with cut sod bales and salvaged canvas, spread 6 inches of straw over packed earth, and set a second heat core from stacked stone and a short flue pipe vented through a clay-collared roof opening. By dark, the shed held steady at 44 degrees with a small fire and 6 bodies at rest. Without the fire, it still held above freezing for hours. He posted his 12 instruction boards at the church, schoolhouse, pump, and store porch before dawn on November the 29th. Some were torn down by noon. He replaced them by evening with tarred twine through drilled holes so they could not be pulled free without tools. He ran rope lines from his vestibule post to the shed, from the shed to a midpoint marker, and from there to the old wagon path toward town, nodding at 6-step intervals for counting in blindness. He set spare mittens, wool wraps, and 2 tepid water kettles at both shelter points. By afternoon, a handful of households had begun quietly banking north walls with sod and clay, copying what they had mocked. Pride, when chilled hard enough, became practical. Nettie Voss came first near dusk, 13 years old and breathing in sharp bursts, 2 younger brothers behind her with scarves iced at the mouth. She did not ask for charity. She reported conditions as a competent messenger. "Our wood stack is near gone by morning," she said. "Mother cracked the stove seam trying to keep flame high. We cannot keep smoke out now." Clayton handed her 3 kindling bundles tied in twine, 1 pail of stove clay, and a folded sheet with 3 numbered steps in large script. He made her repeat each step back. She did. He sent 1 boy with a small jar of broth and the other with spare mittens, then walked them halfway to the first marker and watched until their lantern disappeared in blowing white. Within 48 hours, 12 households had copied his wall banking method and narrowed stove draws with whatever brick and stone they could find. The phrase Caldwell's burrow still circulated, but now it traveled in lower tones, less as ridicule than as direction. Go past the alkali bench, follow the rope line, keep 1 hand on iron. The change did not redeem earlier cruelty, and Clayton did not pause to measure sentiment. He counted blankets, bodies, and burn rates. He calculated shelter capacity at 38 souls in the house, and 19 in the shed if sleeping in shifts and keeping vestibules clear. On the morning of December 1st, he rode into town once more under a sky the color of cast lead, stopped at Silas's porch, and offered without preface to coordinate fuel and shelter by household count rather than account status. Silas did not accept, but neither did he laugh. His eyes moved from Clayton's rope coils to the west horizon where snow lifted in long white veils. He said, "I will manage my own." Clayton nodded once, left 2 instruction boards by the flour barrels anyway, and rode back before full dark. By then, wind had risen enough to erase hoofprints within minutes, and the first true drifts began forming against every north wall in Sage Hollow. By full dark, the drifts had grown from ankle ridges to knee-high shoulders along every north face in town. And Clayton treated that first accumulation not as spectacle, but as a schedule. He returned to the burrow, lit both lanterns low to conserve oil, and set his ledger open on the vestibule shelf beside a square of chalked slate that listed capacity, fuel, and water in plain numbers any tired hand could read. 38 souls in the main house, if sleepers lay alternating head to foot. 19 in the shed if cots were removed and floor bedding used. 42 gallons of water under canvas, 180 pounds of dried beans, 90 pounds of smoked venison, 140 quarts of canned stores, including 27 jars reserved for children and the infirm because they required less chewing and less fuel to heat. He spent the next 2 hours enlarging the shed intake with an efficiency born of long humiliation. A man who had lost standing learned to plan for refusal, then build anyway. He cut 2 6-foot benches from salvaged wagon planks, set them on stone piers so damp could not wick upward, and fixed peg rails above shoulder height for frozen coats. He spread additional straw to a depth of 9 inches and topped high traffic lanes with old canvas, so boots would not churn the floor into frozen mud. At the heat core, he reset his draft collar to 1/4 open and checked smoke travel with a twist of dry grass. The smoke rose true, curved once at the collar, and cleared cleanly above the ridge. The shed would hold. Nettie Voss returned before midnight with her brothers and an empty clay pail, this time carrying a folded note from her mother, weighted by a button so the wind would not steal it. The note was brief and practical. Seam sealed, draw reduced, smoke controlled, burn slowed by half after second firing. Clayton handed Nettie 2 more pails of stove clay, 3 wrapped loaves from his cellar crock, and a strip map he had drawn with charcoal showing rope knots by distance from the church pump. He told her to count by 6s, never by sight. She repeated it once and tucked the map into her coat lining. Her younger brother asked whether the storm would be gone by Sunday. Clayton answered with the same economy he used for timber lengths. Not by Sunday. Keep water inside and sleep in shifts. Near dawn on December 2nd, he loaded his buckskin mare, Ember, with 2 coils of rope, 12 iron pitons, and a crate of brick offcuts for emergency stove throats. The snow had shifted from grains to hard pellets that stung through wool. He rode the old wagon path to town, dismounted at each dangerous corner, and set guideposts where whiteout would erase doorways into one flat field. At the schoolhouse, he drove 3 pitons into the porch beam and tied a waist-high line running east to the pump, west to the church rail, and south toward the first marker on his own route. He tied each knot with a loop large enough for mittened hands. Children or old men could find this line in dark, with numb fingers, and live because of it. By mid-morning, the project had ceased to be one man's shelter and had become a rough network spread across Sage Hollow by repetition, not by proclamation. Clay pails moved from door to door. Brick scraps disappeared from his sled and reappeared in stove throats where fire had formerly rushed to waste. Women who had ignored him in October now sent older sons to ask the correct ash depth for slower burn. He answered each question as if no insult had preceded it. 1 inch under green wood, less under seasoned stock, never cleaned to bare iron during severe wind. At the church kitchen, he showed 2 committee women how to hang a kettle above masonry instead of open flame so soup could hold its heat without swallowing a quarter cord before noon. 3 days earlier, the same committee had declined his instruction. Now they copied his marks in flour dust on a breadboard because paper was scarce. The transformation was not dramatic and did not arrive with apology. It came through motion. Hands that once gestured against him now measured with him. At noon, as the storm light dimmed to a strange pewter gray, Clayton crossed to the general store with his coat crusted white and his beard stiff at the edges. Silas stood inside the doorway between stacked flour barrels and lamp crates, still upright in his good coat, though his cuffs were damp and his boots no longer polished. Shelves behind him remained mostly full, yet a new disarray had entered the room. Kerosene tins pulled down in haste, biscuit crates split, a queue of buyers arguing over weight and credit while wind pushed smoke backward through the stovepipe. Clayton placed 2 of his instruction boards by the counter and spoke so all could hear, because weather did not negotiate in private. Seal your seams now. Set your draft low and steady. Move water inside before sunset. If you have less than 2 days of dry wood, shift children and elders to church or to my bench before dark. Silas looked at the boards and then at the faces in line, measuring profit against pride before a room that had always confirmed him. He said, "You built for burrowing because you had no means to build upright. Do not call thrift a doctrine and fear a system." A ranch hand laughed from the back and repeated, "Caldwell's burrow," drawing the words long enough to invite others in. 2 men joined him. The sound carried brittle and confident. The old social music played against approaching harm. Clayton did not raise his voice and did not wait for silence. "Mockery does not alter temperature," he said. "By nightfall, this wind will shear through every loose seam in town. I have rope lines set. Use them or do not. They will remain." He lifted one board, nailed it to a post by the front door with 3 blows, and left the second on the counter under Silas's ledger weight. No one stopped him. No one thanked him. The line of buyers shifted forward as if nothing had happened, but 3 women at the rear stepped out quietly and followed him into the yard. The afternoon became the hour of organized dismissal, sharp and petty in equal measure. Reverend Talbot, pressed by elders who feared panic, sent a young deacon to ask Clayton not to disturb order by speaking of shelter transfers during evening prayer. At the same time, 2 prosperous households told their hired men that no Caldwell rope would be tied to their porches, as if rope itself carried shame. Boys ran along the drifted lane chanting, burrow man," then stopped when one of them fell waist-deep into a hidden ditch and had to be hauled free by the very line he mocked. Clayton kept working. He marked each refusal in memory, not for resentment but for routing. If a house denied line access, he plotted an alternate anchor at the fence post beyond it. If a porch owner barred public water barrels, he shifted his barrel to the church shed and marked the location in chalk. When the deacon returned with the reverend's request, Clayton handed him 2 blankets and said, "Order without heat is only arrangement. Put these near the north transept door. Children will need them first." By the first week of December's 2nd day, the town's hierarchy had begun to crack along practical seams. Wealthy houses still displayed confidence in public while quietly sending servants for clay after dusk. Families that had laughed in October now asked Nettie Voss to read Clayton's stove instructions aloud, because her voice stayed steady, and she had memorized each step. At the pump, a woman who had called his bench a grave in summer pressed a sack of onions into his arms without meeting his eyes. It was not reconciliation. It was a barter between necessity and conscience. Late in the day, warning signs multiplied with a precision Clayton recognized from older winters and from Elias Ward's instruction. The moon rose behind a thin veil and wore a tight, bright ring, then a second wider halo by full dark, a sign of high ice and deeper moisture riding above the cold front. Horses in lower corrals turned their hindquarters to the northwest long before gusts strengthened, conserving heat by instinct. Chickens that usually settled after dusk refused their roost and crowded against leeward walls. At Willow Creek, a skin of new ice formed in plates that shuddered but did not break, then thickened in less than an hour. Each sign said the same thing in different language: sustained force, not passing weather. Clayton rode town limits once more and called warnings at each cluster of houses, never using broad prophecy, always using tasks. Bring in 6 buckets now. Stuff rags at sill cracks. Bank that north wall before the next bell." Some listened at once. Some nodded and did nothing. A carpenter who had inherited one of Clayton's old contracts told his neighbors that rapid cold often broke after midnight and that heavy burning could ride them through. He had skill with timber and none with thermal mass, but status made his claim persuasive. Several households took his side and fed their stoves hard to prove command over the night. At the store, Silas posted a notice promising rail resupply within 48 hours. Though no telegraph had come through and no locomotive smoke had been seen westward all day. Men read the notice and repeated it as if print itself generated freight. They bought the last easy bundles and left with faces set in borrowed certainty. Behind the counter, Jonah Pike asked whether the figure was true. Silas answered, "Truth is what keeps a line from breaking." It was a merchant's sentence, useful in mild seasons and deadly in hard ones. After sunset, Clayton ran final checks on every line from church to schoolhouse to bench. He added cross knots at shoulder height where drifts were already climbing above the waist. He stationed 2 lanterns in shielded niches at the midpoint marker and filled both with measured oil, 1 pint each, enough for 5 hours if the wicks were trimmed short. He gave Nettie a brass whistle and strict terms: 3 blasts for medical need, 2 for lost traveler, 1 for fuel relay. No one would shout into 50-mile wind and be heard. Signals had to travel by code, or not at all. A little after 8 in the evening, he stood in the churchyard, while Reverend Talbot locked the vestry and watched blown snow race flat across the graves. The Reverend finally spoke without committee language. "I did not heed you when I should have. What do we do now?" Clayton answered by handing him a chalk slate. "Write household counts by pew row. Move children to the nave center, elders to the south wall, strongest men to rope duty in pairs. Keep kettles warm, not boiling. Boiling wastes wood." Talbot took the slate and began assigning names before the sentence finished. By the second bell of the night, the wind rose from harsh to relentless. It no longer arrived in gusts with pauses. It pressed continuously, a broad, unseen weight that bent smoke sideways, shook shingles loose, and drove snow into cracks no eye could track. The first true whiteout rolled down from the northwest ridge as one moving wall, swallowing fence lines, then porches, then the distinction between road and field. Lamps vanished 10 paces from their own doors. Dogs went silent. Doors that had stood all autumn with loose latches now slammed and held under packed drift. Clayton reached his bench at last light's end, checked both shelters, counted every blanket twice, and set broth kettles at the edge of simmer. From town came the muffled toll of the church bell, then another, then none at all as wind took the sound and carried it flat into the dark. The warning period was over. The long test had begun. The first full hour after the bell went silent stripped Sage Hollow of its familiar shape. Roof lines disappeared behind driven white, then fences, then the narrow confidence of streetsmen had walked for a decade without looking down. At 9 in the evening on December the 2nd, 1887, Clayton's thermometer at the vestibule post read -12 degrees, and by midnight it had fallen to -24, while the wind held steady above 50 miles per hour, not striking in bursts but shoving without rest, as if the basin itself were being pressed flat. Rope became law. He moved with one gloved hand locked on the knots, carrying 2 children from the lower lane to the church in a grain sled, then returning with an old ranch cook whose left boot had split through at the sole. At each transfer he counted aloud, so those behind him could match distance in dark. 6 steps to first knot, 12 to anchor post, 18 to church rail. The line trembled under gusts, then steadied, and bodies came through one by one in bent postures, heads down, blankets tied at the waist so wind could not tear them loose. Inside the church, Reverend Talbot had done as instructed. Pews were cleared from the center aisle. Kettles held at low steam near brick. Household counts were chalked by row, then erased and rewritten as more souls arrived. Before dawn on December the 3rd, the town's prevailing winter plan failed in a single predictable sequence. Oversized stoves were fired hard against dropping temperature, then fed green wood that hissed, smoked, and left creosote slick in flues already stressed by wind reversal. Seams opened. Stovepipes rattled loose at elbows. Heat surged and vanished. By first light, several of the tallest frame houses held rooms no warmer than outdoor sheds, and the families who had prized their high ceilings now found themselves hanging quilts from rafters to trap what little warmth remained below shoulder level. The store remained open through that morning because habit persisted beyond prudence. Silas Pemberton stood behind his counter with a scarf over his mouth, hands raw from handling wet sacks, while buyers pushed in from both doors and demanded flour, lamp oil, and any wood left under his awning. He kept his ledger dry under an upturned crate and sold by short measure to stretch inventory through the day. But inventory had mathematics no voice could defeat. By noon, his seasoned stock was gone. By evening, only green cottonwood remained, and that too had been claimed at prices many signed, because they had no other route to morning. When Jonah Pike lifted a lamp toward the back room, he found frost needling along the inside wall where heat had already retreated. Night closed without easing. On December 4th, the temperature at Clayton's bench reached -38 before sunrise. He reduced movement to strict necessity, sending relays only in pairs and only on whistle signal. Nettie Voss became one of his most reliable runners, not because she was fearless, but because she obeyed count and rope without improvisation, carrying written stove instructions to households that still refused to relocate. Her brothers remained under blankets in the shed, fed broth and beans in small portions to conserve fuel and digestion. In town, the phrase Caldwell's burrow changed again. Men no longer drew it out for laughter. They said it quickly, as one gives a direction to water. That afternoon, Ruth Bell, the midwife who had delivered half the town's children in better years, was found in her kitchen chair by two women following a rope from the church. She had stacked green wood near the stove and shaved tinder from dry chair rungs after her kindling failed, then tried to strike flame with hands too stiff for flint. The room showed care to the end. Water bucket moved close to the hearth, quilts folded beside the table, a kettle set ready though never warmed. She had died seated upright, shawl pinned at the throat, as if waiting for the next knock. Reverend Talbot recorded her name first in the church death register and read it aloud once, no embellishment, before returning to ration duty. By first light on December 5th, the wind had carved drifts above door lintels on the north side of town and shouldered over porch roofs in smooth white slabs. Clayton and two volunteers tunneled to blocked entries with grain shovels cut short for confined work, pulling trapped families through window openings and passing them hand to hand into sleds lined with old feed sacks. Each transfer consumed fuel, daylight, and strength, but refusing transfer consumed lives faster. He ordered no one by status. He assigned by body count and exposure risk. A ranch foreman slept beside a seamstress family in the same 6-foot berth. A schoolteacher took the second stirring shift in the church kettle line, beside a hired hand she had ignored all autumn. At the general store, social standing broke where physics had no use for it. On the morning of that same day, Silas's stovepipe cracked 2 feet above the collar after repeated overfiring and sudden downdrafts. Smoke rolled back into the room and froze in thin crystals around the window sash. He tried to patch the split with stove clay and wire, then with sheet tin cut from an oil can, but the draw never recovered. Heat failed from the top down. Shelves that had represented security in October now stood half bare and rigid with cold, flour sacks hardening at the corners, lamp oil thickening in tins. By evening, he closed the doors and moved his cash box to an inner shelf, not to protect profit, but because metal left near the wall stuck to skin. Near midday, someone claimed to hear a locomotive whistle from the spur. Men stepped out from lee walls to listen, hats pressed low, mouths open in the wind. No train appeared. The posted notice promising resupply curled under ice on the store door, unreadable except for the final line, which had frozen into irony. Near dusk that same day, Otto Klein did not return from his barn. He had set out with a lantern under his coat to check a calving pen and tie a loose gate before drift buried it. At some point between house and barn, wind erased his line of travel. Searchers found him 10 yards from the barn door after midnight, one hand inside his coat still cupping the lit lantern as if guarding a fragile promise. The flame had survived. He had not. The men who brought him in did so without speech, boots squealing on packed snow in the church vestibule, faces white with rime and shame. Morning of December 6th brought no break in force, only a drier, meaner cold that punished small errors immediately. Water discipline became as decisive as fuel. Buckets left near door cracks skinned over in less than an hour. Clayton ordered all containers wrapped and elevated off floor contact where possible, then assigned children old enough for simple tasks to break thin surface ice at set intervals with wooden spoons. It was work that kept small hands useful and out of panic. No child was sent outside. No child was left without an adult count. The rule held even when labor was short. Before noon, a relay reached Marta Jansen's house. A widow of 62, she had taken in 2 boarders after her son moved north for rail work, and she had given her last dry blankets to those boarders when their fire fell. She was found beside an unsealed window seam she had meant to patch at daybreak, half conscious and rigid with cold, pulse thin but present. Clayton's team got her into a sled wrapped in wool and feed sacking, warmed her by stages at the church kitchen wall, and kept her breathing through the afternoon. One boarder survived because she had moved him closer to the stove during the night. The other helped carry kindling once his hands could close again. Marta's name was entered on the church care board, not the death register, and 3 candles were lit on the sill at noon, despite oil scarcity, because some forms of accounting had to be kept even in famine weather. The suffering altered even those who had resisted evidence longest. Men who had called clay and sod a poor man's tricks now begged for clay pails and asked how thick to pack north walls. Women who had declined relocation sent notes tied in cloth, requesting transfer for elders first, then for themselves last. Clayton answered every request by route priority, not by memory of insult. He moved souls where wall mass could hold, and where bodies could share heat without suffocation. He cut rations by labor category and posted them in large script so no one mistook fairness for favoritism. The burrow and shed burned 2 small fires that never flared and never died. By contrast, most town stoves had consumed their best wood by the 5th day and were eating the future. At midday on December the 7th, help came to his door in organized form. Reverend Talbot with Nettie at his side, and Jonah Pike behind them carrying a rolled store ledger, as if records might still matter more than warmth. They reached the bench with coats crusted to the elbow, and Talbot spoke in clipped lines between breaths. Church count is 78. Schoolhouse count is 24. We have fuel for 1 more night at current draw, perhaps less. We need your routing and your ration order, and we need it now. Clayton took the numbers, checked his slate, and answered without pause. Move all children under 10 to the church south aisle where wall contact is strongest. Shift single adults from church to shed in 4 relays before dark. Pike, you and I will salvage brick from the old kiln stack for stove throats at church and schoolhouse. Nettie will carry whistle code to every rope post. Talbot will close the nave north doors and seal with feed sacks and clay. He handed Talbot a bundle of chalkboards, gave Pike 2 iron bars and a rope coil, and sent Nettie back with venison strips wrapped in cloth for her brothers. No condition was attached. No apology was requested. The second approach came at dusk, slower and more difficult to witness. Silas Pemberton arrived on foot from the store, beard sheathed in ice, hat gone, boots split at both seams and bound with twine. He followed the rope by touch, missed the final turn, and struck the vestibule post, shoulder first before finding the latch. Jonah Pike, who had returned ahead of him with kiln brick, started to speak, then stopped when Clayton lifted a hand for silence. Silas stood in the entry breathing steam, his coat front stiff as board, fingers curled inward from cold and strain. The prosperous bearing that had once filled his porch was gone, not replaced by humility yet, only by exhaustion stripped to bone. He did not make a speech. He said, "My stove failed. The back room is ice. I have 6 families at the store with no burn left by morning." Clayton stepped aside, guided him to the masonry bench, and cut away the twine at his boots with a short knife. He set a cup of tepid broth in Silas's hands, then another on the floor for Pike, and called through the inner door for 2 spare blankets and 1 dry pair of socks from the second shelf. After Silas had swallowed twice and his breathing steadied, Clayton placed the chalk slate on his knees and tapped the blank column, waiting for names. "Write the 6 families," he said. "We move them in pairs on the next lantern round." Silas wrote with fingers that shook, pressing hard enough to score the slate, and when he had finished the 6th household, Clayton checked each address against the church count, then handed the slate to Nettie with a fresh strip map and a lantern trimmed low. Pike took the first relay to the store with 2 ropemen and a grain sled. Talbot took the second from the schoolhouse. Clayton took the third himself, moving from knot to knot through a white dark that erased distance and left only touch, breath, and the weight of another person leaning into the same line. By dawn on December 8th, the 6 store families had been split between church, shed, and burrow according to age, injury, and fuel need. Clayton posted new ration figures in chalk at all 3 sites, reducing adult portions by 1 ladle per day to preserve child servings through a projected 4 more nights of severe wind. He did not hide the numbers. He taught them. A mason laborer learned to keep the stove throat clear of clinker without raising draw. 2 widows learned to temper stove clay with straw so patches held under rapid cooling. Talbot learned to count room heat by wall temperature and breath frost, not by flame height. Nettie learned to log kettle use by quart and hour. Pike learned to split damp cottonwood to expose drier heartwood and stage it near masonry before burning. Every lesson carried immediate consequence, and no lesson required praise. The contrast between old wealth and prepared scarcity became visible in plain arithmetic. Before the storm, several large homes had purchased 8 and even 10 cords at prices that rose from $7 to $11 per cord as panic buying spread, then burned through most of it in less than a week because draft and volume swallowed heat. Clayton's bench, mocked as cramped and poor, had consumed less than 2 cords by the 9th day because the walls stored what the fire gave and returned it slowly through the night. Men who had laughed in October now sat by his stove with account books on their knees, asking what wall thickness was required for a room 12 by 14, what vent size held best in crosswind, what slope prevented meltwater from entering bermed seams. He answered each question with measurement, not memory of insult. On December 10th, the wind eased for 4 hours and then returned with colder force, a final hammer stroke that tested every repair made in haste. That afternoon, little Eli Navarro was buried beside his father's winter coat in the churchyard drift, the grave cut shallow by frozen ground and marked with a pine board because stone setting would wait for thaw. His mother stood through the prayer with one hand on the board and no tears left to spend. No one spoke of fault in that hour. They spoke of sequence, delayed ceiling, overfired stove, loft draft, delayed transfer. The town had begun to learn that weather punished delay first and pride second, but punished both. 3 days later, on December the 13th, the barometer rose steadily for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Wind fell from a scream to a hard whistle, then to moving air that men could face without turning away. The thermometer at Clayton's vestibule climbed from -31 at dawn to -12 by noon. Relays shifted from rescue to recovery. Teams opened block doors from the lee side and marked unsafe floors with charcoal crosses. Clay pails were reclaimed, mixed, and reissued. Store inventory was counted under Pike's hand with Talbot as witness. Flour, 3 sacks. Lamp oil, 5 tins thickened but usable. Green wood, 2 1/2 cords now sold at cost by Silas's written order. Sugar, none. Coffee, none. Beans, limited and worm-marked. Kerosene wicks, short. When the thaw finally came in the last week of December, it arrived dirty and slow, with roof sheets sliding in midday sun and roads reappearing as trenches between gray banks. The reckoning did not gather in one grand speech. It moved house to house, tool to tool, ledger line to ledger line. Families dismantled oversized stove throats and brought the iron pieces to Clayton for resizing. Men who had paid cash for decorative trim in summer now paid in labor days to raise earth berms and interior partitions that held winter heat where bodies slept. Women who had once stepped around him in silence came to the bench, carrying eggs, mended gloves, lamp wicks, and lists of measurements written in careful hand. On January 4th, 1888, Talbot asked Clayton to stand after service and teach one lesson before dismissal. Clayton agreed on the condition that no hymn be cut and no name be praised. He set a single brick on the front table, a strip of tin beside it, and a jar half full of warm water. "Heat leaves where resistance is least," he said, "not where vanity says it should leave." He showed them flame under tin and then under brick, showed them how quickly one cooled and how long the other held. He gave no accusation. He gave dimensions, 20-inch walls where possible, at least 12 where not. South vestibules, sealed north seams, interior water stores for 6 days, ropes at 4-foot anchor intervals for whiteout movement. Souls took notes in church margins and on feed invoices. No one laughed. Silas's admission came a week later and was shorter than the town expected. He stood at the church rail without coat despite the cold, his face leaner, beard cut uneven where frost had damaged it. "I called prudence cowardice because waste was profitable to me," he said. "I sold green wood at $11 when I knew better, and posted certainty when I had none to post. I will not ask that those words be forgotten. I will publish fuel at cost until next harvest, and my rear lot is deeded this morning for a communal storehouse with winter walls built to Caldwell measure." He unfolded the deed and gave it to Talbot in full view of the congregation. Pike confirmed the filing at the county office 2 days afterward. External doubts ended there. Others came in their own time. The carpenter who had dismissed thermal mass walked to the bench with his son and asked to apprentice 1 month without wage so he could relearn winter building. The committee woman who had declined demonstrations asked for plans for schoolhouse retrofits and returned with 12 volunteers. Nettie Voss, practical and stubborn, organized a cellar cooperative so no widow entered November without sealed stores and dry kindling. Even those who never spoke apology changed habit in visible ways. They lowered ceilings in sleeping rooms, lined north walls with sod, and kept emergency water indoors. The old joke Caldwell's Burrow remained in use, but now it meant any house built to hold through hard weather. By the second week of February, Clayton had crews working 6 days each week on 12 earth-burned winter rooms across Sage Hollow, paid in labor exchange, staple goods, and small coin where possible. He tracked each job in a new ledger: wall thickness, window orientation, stove throat dimensions, first firing date, projected seasonal fuel draw. The communal storehouse rose on Silas's deeded lot with stone footings from the old kiln, adobe infill, and a divided cellar reached by interior hatch. Over its door, Talbot proposed a verse. Clayton refused verses and carved a plain line from Elias Ward's teaching into a lintel board. A wall that keeps heat does not boast. It simply does not surrender. In March, rail traffic resumed irregularly. The superintendent's report, copied by Pike and posted at the church, confirmed what rumor had muddled. Derailed coal cars west of Rawlins, telegraph outages from ice-loaded lines, and whistle echoes carried by wind through the cut that had fooled men into hearing a train that never came. Distinctive signs that once seemed superstition were now cataloged as practical warnings in a school copybook compiled by Nettie Voss under Clayton's supervision. Early geese departure, high beaver dams, rapid evening temperature collapse, haloed moon with tightening ring, stock turning hindquarters to northwesterlies. The school taught the list each October. A decade later, in November 1897, Sage Hollow counted 389 souls. Fuel records kept at the storehouse showed average household consumption near 3 cords per winter, down from roughly 10 in the years before the blizzard. The church, schoolhouse, and most homes had rope anchors set at regular intervals and vestibules deep enough to break wind before it reached the hearthroom. No child in town used Caldwell's Burrow as an insult. Children used it as a verb. Build it like Caldwell, they said, when they packed clay around a seam or checked draft with a candle. Clayton never regained the social rank he held before death, and he did not seek it. He gained something stricter and more useful: authority tied to method rather than applause. He trained apprentices in pairs, required ledgers for every build, and turned away no household that arrived ready to measure true, whether that household had mocked him or defended him. When asked directly, sometimes by newcomers, sometimes by old neighbors still carrying shame, whether he had forgiven Sage Hollow, he gave the same answer he had first spoken over a chalk slate in the coldest week of his life. "I will teach every hand that comes ready to measure true," he said. "Whether you call that forgiveness is yours to carry." The burned rooms still stand above and beyond the old street, low against the wind, warm long after sundown, and in hard winters the town survives not by pride of height, but by the patient knowledge passed wall to wall. On the first Monday of December 1897, with a new storm already pushing down from the Powder River country, Clayton stood in the communal storehouse that had once been Silas Pemberton's rear lot and opened the old winter ledger beside the new one, then ran his thumb down 2 columns that told the whole transformation in numbers. The left column, copied from 1887, showed households burning 8, 9, sometimes 10 cords and still waking to frost on wash basins. The right column, recorded in Nettie Voss's clear hand, showed most homes at 3 cords, some at 2 1/2, with warmer night rooms and fewer chimney repairs. Silas watched him read, then lifted 3 burlap sacks to the sorting table and said, "These are from the reserve pit. Beans dry, no mold. We issue by household count, not by account." Clayton nodded once and took chalk to slate. He assigned 50 pounds to the church kitchen, 30 to the schoolhouse annex, and 20 to the widow cooperative cellar, then handed the remaining 10 to Nettie for the family's outside town grade who still rode in by sled and could not reach central fires quickly. The work moved with practiced rhythm. Pike trimmed lamp wicks to quarter-inch and capped each tin after filling. 2 apprentices weighed smoked venison strips into 1-pound cloth wraps and tied each with twine knots children could untie with cold fingers. 3 women stirred stove clay in shallow troughs and checked consistency against the standard Clayton had taught for years. Thick enough to hold a ridge, wet enough to press into hairline seams before it skinned over. By noon, the wind had begun to sharpen. Not yet the weapon it had been that winter of death, but strong enough that rope lines were uncoiled and checked anyway. Nettie, now 23 and carrying her own copybook of weather signs, walked each anchor in sequence from church porch to school rail to the first alkali marker, tapping every iron eye bolt with a hammer and listening for hollow looseness. At the old midpoint post, she found 1 bolt turning in punky wood, marked it with red cloth, and sent a boy for replacement timber. No one mocked the caution. A carpenter and a seamstress came together with shovel and maul, reset the post 3 feet deeper, and packed the base with broken stone from the kiln pile. That evening, as snow began to move level across the street, families came in by pairs and threes, not frantic, not proud, carrying their own blankets, water buckets, and ration cards. In the church kitchen, Talbot's successor read the shelter list aloud, while Pike checked off arrivals. At the schoolhouse annex, children over 10 ladled broth to younger ones in measured portions and then recorded kettle levels on slate. In Clayton's original bermed house, now used as a training shelter, apprentices rotated through the same tasks he had once done alone, checking draft with tallow flame, reading wall heat by palm contact, and turning damp split wood near masonry before feeding it to fire. No one froze that week. No one wandered 10 yards from safety and vanished into drift. On the 3rd night, when wind rose near 40 and drove snow through any seam left neglected, one widow's stovepipe split above the collar, but her grandson had already attended 2 autumn drills. He sealed the crack with straw-tempered clay, reduced draw by 1/3, and moved her to the church south aisle before midnight. The next morning he brought the damaged pipe to Clayton, who set it on the bench and used it as a lesson piece. "Failure speaks," he told the apprentices. "It says where we were careless. Listen, before weather repeats itself." 3 days after that storm passed, the town gathered in the church for the winter memorial service that had become custom each December. There were no decorations beyond pine branches and 3 plain boards on the front rail, each carved with a name: Ruth Bell, Otto Klein, Eli Navarro. The names were never moved. Silas entered early, thinner than in his merchant prime and slower in the knees, carrying a folded paper. He waited until the hymn ended, then stepped forward and unfolded what proved to be the original price sheet from November 1887, the one showing green wood at $11 per cord. He held it where all could see and said, "I kept this because shame should have a document. I profited while warning signs were visible. I posted certainty about rail resupply when no wire had confirmed it. I did that. I will die having done that." No one interrupted him. Jonah Pike stood next and spoke the sentence he had withheld years earlier when Clayton first admitted Silas half-frozen into the vestibule. At that door, I looked at him and meant to say we should turn him away for what he had done to families that week. Clayton raised his hand and I kept silent. He was right, and I was wrong. He placed his palm flat on the railboard carved for Otto Klein and stepped back. After Pike, others came in uneven order, not compelled by ritual but by accumulated weight. Lars Jansen said his sister Marta had heard Clayton's warning in October and repeated Silas's porch joke anyway, because she did not wish to stand apart from her neighbors, and he had laughed with her instead of stopping it. The carpenter who once dismissed thermal mass admitted that he had told men rapid cold always broke by midnight because he preferred inherited confidence to unfamiliar method. A committee woman confessed she had declined Clayton's demonstration to avoid panic among church donors and had mistaken social peace for prudence. Even those who could not form full apologies made concrete offers. 2 Labor Days each month for annual rope inspections, free wagon use for clay hauling, and shared seed for families who spent scarce coin winterizing walls. The service did not become spectacle. It became accounting. Talbot's successor read the old telegraph bulletin and the rail superintendent report aloud once each winter, not because anyone doubted them now, but because memory softened facts unless facts were spoken in full. The children listened as if hearing law. They copied the weather list into school copybooks. Early geese, high beaver dams, rapid evening temperature collapse, haloed moon tightening, stock turning from northwesterlies. They also copied the practical sequence beneath it: water inside, seams sealed, draw reduced, lines checked, elders moved first. When the last confession had been spoken, all eyes turned to Clayton. He didn't move to the front rail. He remained beside the side aisle stove where he had been checking draft during the service, one hand still black with soot from the collar seam. His reply carried through the room because no one else spoke. "You ask a word that settles accounts between hearts," he said. "I do not have such a word to give on command. We buried 3 neighbors because caution was mocked until weather made argument useless. That cannot be polished into a simple pardon. But this I can give because it belonged to my teacher before it belonged to me. Any hand that comes ready to measure true, I will teach. Any house that needs wall, seam, stove throat, or line anchor, I will help set. If you need a sentence beyond that, make your own and live inside it." He returned then to the stove, adjusted the damper, and motioned the apprentices forward. The response was action, not applause. Men who had spoken shame took shovels and went straight to the church north wall to deepen berm before nightfall. Women carried the old memorial boards to fresh varnish so the carved names would not weather away. Pike and Nettie inventoried remaining stores and marked every sack, jar, and strip by issue date. Of the original emergency cache Clayton had built a decade earlier, only one relic remained in use: a brass whistle, dented on one side, now hung by the church door and tested every first Saturday of November so children would recognize its code in storm. By January 1903, Clayton's apprentices had become instructors, and instruction itself had become public duty. On the second Saturday of each month from October through March, the schoolhouse hosted open measure nights. Families brought their own room dimensions, stove sketches, and fuel receipts. No fee was charged. Silas funded lamp oil for those sessions until his death, and Pike maintained the ledgers after him with signatures from 2 witnesses each season. When disagreements arose, they were settled by trial burn and wall reading, never by rank. Clayton died in February 1909 at 61 years, not in crisis and not alone, but in his original bermed house with a low, steady fire in the masonry stove and 2 apprentices at his table copying final notes on vent collars and cellar drainage. He was buried above the alkali bench where willow roots now held spring runoff in place. The town set no statue. They set anchors. The bermed rooms still stand above and beyond the old street, low against the wind, warm long after sundown. And in hard winters, Sage Hollow survives by the same patient knowledge, passed from hand to hand, measured true,